So this is joint work with co-editors Matteo Boba at Toulouse School of Economics and Lucie Gaden at Queen Mary University. So let's just jump in. Let me start by perhaps many of you who are seeing this do not need to be motivated by this, but still, like, I think it's important to state the dimension of the phenomenon that we are looking at. So, and in particular, high informality is a defining characteristic of most developing economies. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a map that I think it's quite nice to visualize how concentrated informality is in developing countries. This is just from the Eurostat website. On the right-hand side, you can see a couple of figures that also give you the magnitude of this phenomenon. So it ranges from 30 to 70% of all economic activity in developing countries, also 20 to 80% of the labor force, and as well, like a very large share of firms. So we're talking about a very important and big phenomenon. A second important fact to just set the stage to the literature we will be discussing today. This is also a well-known fact. Informality is strongly and negatively correlated with economic development. Doesn't matter which measure you use. Here I'm using log of GDP per capita. And you can see a strong negative correlation between, in this case, the share of informal labor and GDP per capita in many countries. Now, this is also has been easily made a connection between this sort of correlation and the idea that, for example, countries could simply grow out of informality. And this is something I'll show you another graph in a second that I think it's quite interesting. But the literature that I will discuss with you today actually takes a completely different step, in a sense that, and considers informality yet as another important endogenous outcome. In this case, an aggregate outcome, that is a result simply of economic agents behaving optimally in face of the economic, social, and political environment that they face. So instead of like thinking about any sort of suggestion that there could be a causal relationship here, a direct causal evidence, instead you could think about it as informality and development being a determinant, jointly determinant, by different sets of determinants, and this is exactly the type of things we will discuss in this literature review. But also, there will be some feedback effects from informality into economic development, which is the second part of this presentation, and what the literature has also discussed quite extensively is the consequences of informality. Now, what's also interesting, and this is a graph that I borrowed from Penny Goldberg's Gorman lecture last year here at UCL, but also it's been produced by the World Development Report team. You can see that there's huge variation in the size of the informal sector, even within income groups. So here's three income groups: low, lower middle, and upper middle income. And you can see that, for example, in low income countries, informality can range as a share of employment from almost 100% in Nepal and all the way to 36% in Ethiopia. And same thing in lower middle income countries, all the way to upper middle income countries. You have Paraguay with 71% of the labor force being formally employed, and Bulgaria with only 19%. So also, like, the level of development doesn't explain, not nearly explain the vast majority of variation that one observes across countries in informality levels. And then finally, going back to this idea that countries can grow out of informality, this is a very interesting graph from a PhD thesis at Penn State 2 years back now, Tanmay Belavadi. And here it's plotting changes and levels, but especially changes in GDP per capita over the 2000s for different developing countries on the x-axis, and changes in informal employment in the y-axis. And you can see here that many countries, especially in Latin America, such as Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, did experience during the 2000s this joint, let's say, behavior or phenomenon of increasing the level, increasing its GDP per capita, or increasing development, and reducing informality at the same time. But also many other countries, important countries in this developing country spectrum, did not experience that. And here he highlights India because that's the object of his research. But India actually is a quite remarkable case that more than doubled its GDP per capita in that decade, but basically had no change in informality levels during this period. But also it's true in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Mexico, Thailand. So this idea that countries can grow out of informality is not supported by the data. Of course, some countries have experienced that, others have not. But what's most important is to understand the underlying causes of informality that can also be directly related to levels of GDP per capita, and how these levels of informality can then translate into different levels of output growth and so on. So this is exactly what this review aims to do by covering an extensive literature that's been produced on informality. And these high levels of informality have significant implications for firms, workers, families, consumers, so at a very micro level. But these all add up, of course, to potentially large effects on aggregate outcomes that we also care about, such as aggregate output, productivity levels, economic growth. And therefore, understanding the causes and consequences of informality are arguably a key dimension for the better understanding of economic development itself and the process through which countries can develop. Now, exactly because informality ranges from the very micro to the very macro side of things, the informality literature is not only quite extensive, but it's also wide-ranging. So you have studies that have very rigorous empirical designs and identification strategies, both experimental and non-experimental, that had looked at for example, the determinants of firms' decision regarding being informal or not. Same thing with workers. And also the potential implications of formalization decisions for both firms and workers on their outcomes later on. You also have, on the other side of the spectrum, more macro approaches using macro models, equilibrium macro models, to try and understand how different policies that aim at reducing informality could affect aggregate outcomes, and not only informality, but unemployment, output, and growth. And also, in a more recent development, you have a series of structural papers that take this structural approach to understand, again, the connection between micro decisions into aggregate outcomes. So it's a broad literature, but also quite varied in terms of methods. And this VoxDevLit piece has the objective of summarizing this very large literature, and in particular, what we have learned about the causes of informality from the micro to the macro side of things, but also the consequences of informality for economic development. So let me start with some definitions, because especially when one is discussing informality, people have, including the literature, has discussed different definitions of informality. So it's important to be quite precise about what we mean. So let's start with firms. And firms, of course, they can be formal, which means here to be registered with a tax authority, say, or have the relevant licenses to operate, or they can be informal, and that's unregistered business. This is what we will call the extensive margin of informality, the decision of the business to formalize or not. So just to give you an idea, in Brazil, 70% of the businesses are informal, according to this measure. If you go to other, say, sub-Saharan African countries, this is even larger. It can reach more than 90% of firms. Now, going to employment, informal firms can only hire informal workers. But what's interesting then is also that formal firms can hire both types of labor. They can hire formal workers, of course, but they can also hire informal workers. And the fact that we have informal workers employed in formal firms, it's what we're going to call the intensive margin of informality. So that's formally registered business, therefore formal firms, according to the extensive margin definition, but that also hire informal workers. And that's quite a fundamental dimension of informal employment. For Latin America, for example, these are countries that we have direct data that we can measure this intensive margin. It accounts for between 40 and 44% of all informal employment. So this is a quite key dimension of informality that is present throughout everything that we discuss in this lit review. So in terms of the outline of what we'll cover today, I'll talk about some facts first regarding workers and firms. Then we'll move into the determinants of the decision of firms and workers to be formal or informal. And then we'll talk about the consequences of these decisions. So let me start first with facts about workers. So the first thing that has been widely documented in the literature is that informality displays this U-shaped pattern with respect to age. So what it means is that it's the highest among young and older workers. It's also higher among women and low-skilled workers. The second fact is informal employment is strongly counter-cyclical. So what it means that during a recession, informal employment as a share of total employment tends to expand. In periods of booms, the reverse occurs. Now, this is due to mainly two features of the data. The first one is that actually formal job finding rates, that is the probability of a worker finding a formal job, is strongly pro-cyclical. Therefore, when the economy is going through a downturn, it's much harder for workers to find a job in the formal sector, while the informal sector job finding rate is completely stable. So that means that already in relative terms, during a recession, the fraction of individuals employed in informal jobs should expand. But also what's interesting is that informal to formal transitions are also pro-cyclical, meaning when the economy is expanding, there's a higher probability that an informal worker finds a formal job and transits to that sector. Now, of course, when there is a recession, this probability falls, which means then again that it's going to contribute to the fraction of informal jobs expanding as a share of all jobs. Now, there is also, as a third fact, just to set the scene, is that there is a substantial formal-informal wage gap. And this is important because it holds even after controlling for all possible characteristics of workers that one can imagine. Gender, race, even occupational sector, years of schooling, of course, where the person lives in terms of which city, for example. Now, this is important because it's been often interpreted as evidence that there is something intrinsic about formal jobs that make them higher paying than informal jobs, rather than being a difference in terms of the workers that are working in one position versus the other. Now, what's interesting also as a new stylized fact that emerges from the literature is that once one looks within firms, that is comparing formal and informal workers within the same firm, this wage gap disappears. Now, this is important because it can be interpreted as evidence that actually self-selection might be one of the main things that is driving this formal-informal wage gap. The reason I say that is because by looking within firm, we're controlling for firm productivity. Of course, we're not controlling directly for worker productivity, but if there is a sortative matching in the labor market, that is better workers go to better firms, by looking within firm, we are already accounting for a lot of these unobserved differences across workers. Now, and for this evidence is important because it highlights the importance of self-selection as a main driver of the wage gap. It also highlights that conditional on worker skill, and also conditional on the firm they work at, formal and informal workers might be performing very similar tasks within the firm. One important caveat here is that when we're looking within firms, even when we're looking within firms, there's still a wage gap between low-skilled workers that have a formal contract and low-skilled workers that have an informal contract. Now, that's interesting because I just told you that we are already controlling for a lot of the observable and potentially unobservable characteristics of workers. So that suggests, for example, that indeed there are characteristics of formal contracts that could produce a wage gap by themselves. And one of such characteristics is the minimum wage when it's binding in a given country. So the presence of a minimum wage could create, by construction almost, a gap, if it's binding, a gap between wages in the formal and informal sector, even for almost equally productive workers. Let me see if I can hide this. Okay. Let's, maybe this is better. Now, in terms of firms, interesting facts, the important facts that emerge from the literature are the following. The first one is already something that I mentioned, is that the intensive margin of informality, that is the fraction of informal workers working in formal firms, represents a large fraction of total informal employment. This is quite important because if policymakers say are concerned with informal employment and want to tackle this phenomenon, it's not enough to only look at informal firms. They also should look at formal firms hiring informal workers. Now, as been well established in the literature, informal firms are on average, and I'm emphasize on average, smaller, they pay lower wages, the firm owners have lower schooling levels, their workers have lower schooling levels than when compared to formal firms. And of course, they are smaller in size, they have less revenues and also lower profits than formal firms. Now, these differences in averages have been largely or sometimes too quickly interpreted as potentially evidence for duality in the economy between formal and informal sectors. What do I mean by duality is this idea that formal and informal firms would operate in completely separate economic spaces, producing completely different economic goods and using completely different technologies and with barely no contact between these. Now, this is not supported by the data, okay? In fact, there's no evidence of duality in most countries, in most developing countries for which we have good data. In fact, it is possible to see in the data that formal and informal firms coexist even within very narrowly defined industries, meaning that they produce very close products. It can still be the case, of course, that they produce different varieties within an industry, with formal firms potentially specializing in higher quality varieties, while informal firms specialize in lower quality varieties. Also quite interesting, in many different countries and using different data sets, it's been shown also there's a substantial overlap in the productivity distribution of formal and informal firms, also in terms of size distributions. What that means is that one can find equally productive firms, both in the formal or the informal sector, more productive firms in the informal versus formal sector, and so on. So like there is a big range of the productivity support where one can find both formal and informal firms. Again, suggesting that this dual view of informality is not an adequate depiction of the data. Now, also another important fact that has been actually quite important in terms of how people have written, for example, models of informality, is the fact that both margins of informality decline with size. That is, the proportion of informal firms and the proportion of informal workers within formal firms declines as the firms grow bigger. Here, these two graphs show this fact. On panel A here on the left, you see the proportion of informal firms by firm size ranging from 1 worker to 7 workers. So you see a steep decline in the proportion of informal firms. And panel B here shows the proportion of informal workers within formal firms as firms grow bigger from 2 to 7 employees. The reason these graphs stop at 7 is just a data limitation, but if you can see a very monotonic behavior on the graphs. So this suggests that whatever is behind the decision of firms to regarding both margins of informality, it seems that either the costs of remaining informal according to both margins are increasing in firm size, or the benefits of staying formal are decreasing with firm size. And this is very intuitive because, for example, one dominant view and that has guided many of the models that we see in the literature is that there is an increasing cost of operating in the informal sector, increasing in firm size, that could come, for example, from the probability of being detected by the government. The bigger the firm is, the more visible it is for the government. Therefore, more likely it is that a government inspector will visit the firm, and if that occurs, the firm has to pay fines or has to pay bribes. But the point is that it becomes more and more expensive to be in the informal sector if the firm is big. Another way of seeing this is that the costs, the opportunity cost of being formal increases as the firm grows bigger. And that could be, for example, the need for the firm to, for example, issue invoices if it wants to grow bigger, or if it wants to expand, if it wants to grow, it needs to start issuing invoices to its customers, or it wants to participate in government procurement programs and so on. So whatever it's behind, this graph suggests actually that there is this increasing cost of informality as firms grow bigger. Now, what's also interesting, this is also true if we replace firm size with firm age, meaning as firms get older, the proportion of firms in a given cohort that is informal declines with the cohort's age, And the same thing goes for the intensive margin. And this is, again, important because it's associated to how productivity evolves as the cohort gets older. And for most typical, for the simplest model of firm dynamics, there is a dynamic selection, such as a given cohort of firms get older, the least productive firms exit, and the most productive firms continue to expand. And if this is indeed true, one should see exactly what the data shows, that the proportion of informal firms and the proportion of formal firms hiring informal workers should also decline with time. So given these facts, which is a very brief and quick summary of what happens, what has been documented in the literature, let's jump into the determinants, starting with the firms. So in terms of the costs and benefits of informality, and here again, we're now focusing on firms. If policymakers want to reduce informality or increase formalization rates of firms, they can affect or they can use three groups of policies or policy levers. The first one is those policies that aim at reducing the cost of formality. And this can be further broken down into two types of costs. The first one is the cost of entering the formal sector. So for example, registration costs. The second is the cost of remaining formal. And this could be the tax rates that firms face. It could be the amount of red tape involved in tax payments. Whatever it relates to the cost of staying active in the formal sector. As a second group of policies, we can highlight those policies that increase the benefits of formality. So for example, when policymakers improve credit access for formally registered firms, or when they enhance participation in procurement program, government procurement programs that emphasize, for example, small formal firms. These are the kind of things that could increase the benefits of formality for firms and therefore alter their decision between being formally registered or not. And the third group is the group of policies that seek to increase the cost of being formal. So this is typically achieved via greater enforcement. So for example, more intensified inspections on informal firms, or intensified inspections on formal firms to detect those that are hiring informal workers. Now, what we see in the literature by and large is that both policymakers and researchers that have designed randomized control trials with this type of interventions, they have largely focused on the first group. That means policies that aim at reducing the costs of formality. And in particular, they have focused on policies that aim at reducing the costs of entering the formal sector. Policies that increase the benefits of formality have not really been emphasized much. What's interesting, however, is that there is another branch of literature quite related to the informality literature that looks at policies or interventions that could lead to higher growth of especially small and medium businesses in developing countries. Now, there is a vast literature looking at capital, access to finance, access to capital, reductions in the cost of hiring labor, so on and so forth. What's really interesting is that hasn't been the bridge between that literature and the literature that focuses on informality is yet to be built. And this is important because, in particular, one recent study shows that policies that reduce the cost of registering a business, therefore in group 1.1 here, are much more enhanced when they come together with, for example, policies that facilitate access to formal credit to businesses by formal businesses. So the interaction between these policies could be quite powerful to not only increase formalization rates, but also improve and increase firm performance after they formalize. But this is yet a major open avenue for research, and we have still many open questions there. And then finally, group 3 here has received far less attention in the literature. And we have actually one paper that looks at two papers that look at the impact of increasing or enhancing enforcement or government inspections on the likelihood of firms formalizing, and also on firms' performance after they formalize. Now, in terms of what the empirical literature says, here I plotted the normalized impact on formalization rates of different policies across different studies. So you can see every point here corresponds to one experiment in a given paper. So you see the first 4 blue dots here, and I should also say the blue dots are experimental studies. The red dots are non-experimental, using some form of natural experiment to identify the formalization effect. So you can see that the first 4 blue dots here show essentially a 0 effect. And these are the interventions that basically eliminate all entry costs into the formal sector. In these different papers, the authors are not only providing information about all the formalization steps, they are also providing some form of assistance in actually implementing these steps to achieve formalization. And in some of them, they also fully cover any monetary costs that there might be for firms to formalize. And you can see that it's a basic 0 effect. One particular study that I like is the Mel et al. 2013 paper. You can see here in the 4th dot, because actually these 4 dots, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, they are within the same study. So what the authors did is that they did 4 treatment arms to try and see the determinants of firms' decision to formalize. The first one that shows a 0 effect is the one where they cover all registration costs. Then the treatment arms 2 and 3, they provide some monetary incentive for firms to formalize in addition to zeroing entry costs. And they find positive but very modest effects. You can see here in dots 5 and 6, very modest effects on formalization. They only find strong effects in dot number 7 here, where my cursor is. They only find the strong formalization effects when, on top of eliminating entry costs, they offer firms the equivalent of 2 months of the median firm profit here. So that's a quite sizable compensation for firms to formalize. And that's when they see a strong effect. And this type of result has been corroborated in different studies, meaning that perhaps reducing entry costs is a necessary condition, but it's by no means a sufficient condition to induce firms to formalize. It's only when you either increase the benefits of formalization or you reduce the costs of remaining formal that one starts seeing more substantial effects on formalization. Just to summarize what we know from the literature then, providing information about registration and eliminating entry costs has very limited effects on formalization. The largest formalization effects come when one reduces the cost of staying formal or increases the benefits of formality. The policies that increase the cost of informality, meaning that enhance or intensify enforcement, do find strong effects of reducing informality and inducing formalization. Now, what's important that already in one of the papers in the literature is that this can have undesirable effects or negative effects on the firms that receive this shock, of course. And this again will come up when we talk about the aggregate consequences of informality. These policies can have also negative aggregate effects depending on the study that we're looking at. And then finally, these policies that increase the benefits of formality, the few studies that we have suggest that this could actually have beneficial effects in terms of formalization and firm performance, but still there are many open questions here. So why is that? How can we rationalize these results? Well, this is a graph from my work in the AR 2018 that tries to quantify the different views of informality or the different views about informal firms in the literature. So the horizontal axis here is firm productivity, and then on the vertical axis is the payoff of this firm of being formal or informal. So what you can see here, and then you have the solid black line and the dashed black line showing the payoffs of firms. So the solid in the formal sector, the solid black line shows the payoff in the baseline economy. The dashed line shows the payoff when the entry costs into the formal sector are eliminated. And the red line shows the payoff of being formal in both scenarios. What's important here is that this graph that has a structural model underlying it allows me to quantify the different views about informal firms. So let me start by the first one on the right. It's called the De Soto view. So this goes back to the work of Hernandez Soto that argued that the reason of high informality in developing countries is that entry costs into the formal sector, so this registration costs, are too high, and they hold back many productive entrepreneurs that potentially could flourish in the formal sector, but they cannot formalize because they cannot pay this entry costs. If that was the case, then when the results in the literature should actually show strong formalization effects when one reduces these entry costs, and that's not what we see. And in the model here for the Brazilian economy, I show that indeed this De Soto view corresponds to less than 10% of all informal firms. That's a very small number, and therefore it's unlikely that reducing entry costs could produce massive formalization effects, and also many of these entrepreneurs actually transit into the formal sector and flourishing. Now, there's a second view in the literature that the term is quite loaded, but that's how it's being called. It's called the parasite view. It means that in this view, under this view, informal firms are just enjoying the cost advantage that not complying with the regulations and not paying the taxes, the cost advantage that comes from that is what allows them to survive, not only survive in the informal sector, but also earn higher profits than what they would if they were formal. If that's the case, lowering entry costs is not the answer to formalize, because even when policymakers reduce entry costs, these firms will remain in the informal sector because that's the profit maximizing decision for them. It's only when governments increase enforcement that these firms will formalize, because when governments do that, they increase the cost of being in the informal sector by a lot, and then they move into the formal sector. And that's, again, consistent with this strong effects that we see in the empirical literature from increasing enforcement of laws and regulations. Now, the worry with that is that we have the third group, which is the survival view. And this view sees informal firms as a survival strategy for individuals that have low human capital or not, they are not skilled enough to make it as a formal entrepreneur, or even to make it as a formal employee in the formal sector. Because policymakers cannot distinguish between the survival and the parasite view, or the survival and parasite firms, when policymakers increase the enforcement on informal firms, they will be catching both types. The parasite type can actually formalize when it's hit by an enforcement shock. The survival type cannot. And this will translate into these individuals exiting altogether and potentially joining the unemployed pool. So that's why this type of policies can also have adverse consequences in the economy. And I will go back to that. And in terms of additional determinants of firms' decision, of course, the total tax burden is one determinant that has been emphasized, but a less emphasized but potentially equally important determinant is the tax structure that firms face when operating in the formal sector. And one particular important feature is for example, a design that is present in many different countries, is the fact that value-added taxes, firms can have credits. There's a credit scheme in place for firms in a supply chain to be able to get credit for the purchases and that they make. Now, this sort of credit scheme could create a transmission mechanism of formality or informality throughout the supply chain. And this has been investigated in one paper in the literature, showing that indeed it induces this kind of mechanism, and therefore firms that are located in more formal supply chains tend to be more formal themselves, and vice versa, firms located in informal supply chains or production chains tend to be more informal themselves. This is a massive open question, massive open area of research in the literature where we still need to do a lot more to understand the interactions between tax structure and formalization decisions. Finally, an area that has been receiving more attention is the role of trade in determining labor market outcomes, but in particular in determining informal versus formal employment in the economy. So what the literature finds in almost every setting that are present in the literature is strong effects of trade on both firm and labor informality. In particular, one country that has received a lot of attention has been Brazil, because it underwent a massive trade liberalization episode in the 90s, and also was a very strong unilateral trade opening process. So that provides a very natural ground for with a very clean empirical identification. So what we see in studies focusing on Brazil and its experience with the unilateral trade opening is that exposure to foreign competition leads to higher informality, and this is almost entirely concentrated in low-skilled workers. But what's interesting is that this net increase in the informal employment is the result of two opposing forces, or can be the result of two opposing forces. The first one is actually the trade shock induces the least productive informal firms to exit, and this would tend to reduce the fraction of informal employment in the economy. On the other hand, formal firms have to cut costs in face of this competition shock. They also need to downsize oftentimes, and that leads to an increase in the fraction of informal workers within formal firms. So you see that the extensive margin of informality and the intensive margin of informality provide different, or they show different responses in face of the same shock. And then, of course, in the new equilibrium, because it's now harder to survive in the formal sector, exposed to more competition from abroad, you could see in the new equilibrium more firms entering the informal sector rather than the formal sector. On the other hand, the positive side of trade is that actually gaining greater access to foreign markets, and there's particularly strong evidence from Vietnam in this case, can reduce substantially firm informality. Not only that, these firms transit to formality and they actually perform better and they grow and they have gains in productivity. Now, in terms of the employment effects, higher informality is not necessarily bad. And this is an important point to make, I think. Because informality, because it's a more flexible form of employment, it can help reducing employment losses. And that's indeed what we see in Brazil. So the first graph here is showing, the first two bars are showing the effect on informality and non-employment. So informality, the blue bar, non-employment or unemployment, the orange bar. So these are changes in percentage points for all regions in Brazil as a result of the trade shock. So both informality and unemployment increase as a result of trade shock. Now, if we look at regions with weak enforcement, this is the second bar here. In regions with weak enforcement, firms can more easily adjust to the shock by resorting to informal contracts. And indeed, in these regions, you see a much larger effect on informality, but a no effect on unemployment. And then finally, looking at high or strict enforcement areas, this is the last bar to the right, the reverse occurs. There's no effect on informality because in these regions, enforcement is so strict that is too expensive, it's too costly for firms and workers to resort to informal contracts. There you see no effect in terms of informality, but you do see a strong increase in non-employment. Now, what are the welfare effects of these different responses? It's impossible to answer that with this kind of reduced form empirical studies. One needs a structural model to talk about equilibrium effects. And indeed, one does that, the results suggest that informality can be this employment buffer, meaning when firms and workers can resort to informality more easily, the employment losses can be lower in face of a negative shock, but this does not translate into higher welfare. So informality is not a welfare buffer. So that's interesting because even though higher enforcement can produce more, say, unemployment, in net for the whole economy, the welfare effects are not clearly negative. In terms of workers, the role of public policies here, it's key. So the concern is that welfare programs, being means tested or universal programs, could induce individuals to shift the labor supply from formal to informal sector. Especially, so for example, programs that are means tested clearly provide or could provide this incentive because being informal is a way of hiding part of the income of the household, and therefore they could earn this informal income together with gaining access to a given program. But also universal programs could induce the shift because universal programs reduce the cost of being informal. So this is, for example, the case of universal health coverage. And there's been papers analyzing the Seguro Popular, for example, in Mexico, and a similar program in Colombia. And they do find that the introduction of this universal health coverage led to small increases in informal employment. Now, again, this is not talking about welfare effects, because, of course, having universal health coverage can have many strong welfare effects that go a lot beyond the impact on informal employment. But still, like, it's important to understand that what potential unintended consequences this kind of programs can have. Same thing with the cash transfer programs. Now, there's a very interesting contrast between the micro effects and the potentially aggregate effects of this policy. So at the worker level, evidence from Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay indicate that actually these cash transfer programs lead to an increase in informality and non-employment. Again, because they could discourage labor supply, either because a reservation wage increases or because as a way of hiding part of the income and to remain eligible to these programs. Now, what's fascinating that in Brazil, a recent study shows that actually, even though there is this negative effect on formal labor supply at the individual level, the aggregate effects at municipalities that receive a larger shock from these cash transfer programs, the net result of this could be an increase in total formal employment. And this could come actually in spite of increasing informality for the workers that benefit directly from these policies. So even though for beneficiaries of the program, this could induce a small shift into informal employment, because these represent sometimes substantial aggregate shocks to local economies, this could induce an increase in the number of formal jobs locally. And then a crucial active area of research here is to understand the dynamic and life cycle aspects of all these decisions, because of course, many of these dimensions have effects not only in the short run, but in the long run as well. So for example, understanding how this could affect contribution to Social Security or not is an open area for research. Now we are quite advanced on time, so let's get into the consequences of informality. Now, as I mentioned already, anticipated that there hasn't been much interaction between the literature that aims at analyzing the formalization decision of firms and policies that aim at helping firms to grow or to increase productivity. These things have gone a bit in parallel. For the literature that has focused on the formalization or the causes and the formalization effects for firms, this literature has found no effects essentially of formalization on firm performance. So for all the papers in the literature, the typical result is that there is no effect of becoming formal on firm sales, profit, size, growth, productivity, you name it. Now, this is interesting because there were high hopes for formalization as a way to boost firm performance. Now, what's interesting is that the few papers that actually are able to look at firm behavior, not only firm outcomes, but also firm behavior before and after, what they show is that firms that formalize as a result of a given policy do not seem to be changing any meaningful behavior. They do not gain greater access to finance. They do not get access to credit. They do not start having more a designated formal bank account to their business. They do not invest more. So there seems to be, like in these settings at least, when there's no other change in the benefits of being formal or the type of policies that firm can access once they become formal, there are no meaningful changes in firm outcome. Now, of course, these are average results. Whenever the literature has found positive average results, these are driven by a very small number of firms that experience substantial growth after formalization, but this is only for a few that probably were the De Soto firms that we talked about a few slides back. But like this does not reflect the overall impact on the population of firms that formalizes. And then this lack of effect is consistent with this argument that the perceived benefits of formalization are indeed very low. And that's why firms do not formalize in the first place. It's not because costs are super high, but rather because the perceived benefits are quite small. Of course, these effects are being measured in the short run, so 2-3 years after, and it could be the case that these benefits only kick in later in firm's life. But if this is the case, this is not very good news, because the costs of being formal, of course, they kick in immediately upon formalization. So indeed, like still, if this is the case, then the benefits will show up later on. The timing of costs and benefits it's a reason of concern. Another thing in terms of consequences is its taxation and redistribution. So one important thing that has come up recently in the literature is that, of course, if the economy has high informality levels, this could change the incidence of different taxes and their redistributive properties. And in particular, these two graphs show a fascinating result, which is that the share, these are informality angle curves. That is the share of expenditure allocated to informal goods as a proportion of course, of household income, and how it evolves from poor to richer households. And you see a declining proportion of the informal budget share as households become richer. This is important because this has direct implications for policymakers that are thinking about designing progressive, for example, progressive tax regimes. So if given this informality angle curves and the fact that the share declines as households become richer, for example, could imply that the most efficient way, or not the most efficient way, but a progressive taxation system for consumption goods would be a flat rate across all types of goods. In terms of the aggregate effects on human capital, typically, and what the literature has documented is that higher levels of informality can induce lower human capital accumulation in the economy via two main channels. The first one is the fact that high informality levels imply lower returns to schooling in equilibrium. And the reason of that is that the institutions and policies causing this high informality are also associated to more high-skill formal jobs being more costly compared to more low-skill informal jobs. And therefore, in equilibrium, there are more low-skill jobs, and the relative payoff of low-skill jobs compared to high-skill jobs gets distorted by the presence of high informality levels. Now, of course, individuals seeing that in equilibrium, they anticipate this, that they will face this in the labor market, and as the optimal response, they invest less in schooling before getting to the labor market. And indeed, in the study that analyzes this relationship, policies that, for example, increase enforcement and reduce the availability of informal jobs, increase investment in human capital before the labor market. And a second channel that could induce this type of lower levels of human capital is the fact that also informal jobs seem to induce to lower accumulation of human capital on the job. So they accumulate, informal workers accumulate human capital at a much slower rate in the informal sector. And of course, in equilibrium, the more jobs you have of the first type would lead to lower accumulation of human capital even after schooling investments are done. And then finally, in terms of aggregate productivity, output, and growth, of course, as I mentioned already, informality is an endogenous outcome itself. So both the macro and structural literature that have analyzed this question focus on specific policies that could bring down informality by changing the costs and benefits that firms and workers face. And this would translate into different equilibria that have different levels of productivity, output, and growth. Here would focus only on enforcement and entry costs. So in terms of the general message in the literature of the many different papers that have analyzed this question, we see that higher enforcement, of course, it brings down informality because it makes it much more costly for firms to operate in the informal sector. And this actually leads to a gain in average productivity, in aggregate productivity in the economy via 5 different channels. The composition effects, by increasing enforcement, the government is essentially eliminating the lower end of firm productivity in the economy. Because of that, there's also less low quality jobs, and therefore workers have an easier time finding a higher quality job, typically in the formal sector. Because formal firms also can have better and cheaper access to credit and finance in general, this could lead to higher capital accumulation. Also, because there are less low-quality jobs, it affects occupational choices of workers moving away from self-employment and low-skilled jobs in the informal sector and towards higher-paying, higher-quality jobs in the formal sector. And then finally, because of what we just discussed, it can also lead to higher human capital accumulation. Now, what happens in terms of total output really depends on the extent of which firms are displaced because of higher enforcement and how much reallocation of workers there can be from previously informal firms to higher productivity, more productive formal firms. And this is the key thing that remains as an open question. And in particular, how long does it take in this transition path? So the extent of reallocation and how long it takes to go from one equilibrium to the other is key and remains as an open question for research. In terms of decreasing entry costs, it also induces a decrease in informality, but it has different effects and it operates in the economy in very different ways. So the first thing to note is actually the composition effects of reducing entry costs are different than enforcement, because actually reducing entry costs worsens the composition of firms, in particular in the formal sector. It worsens the composition of firms because now it makes it possible for more low-quality firms to survive in the formal sector. On the other hand, it increases the number of firms in equilibrium, but it's unclear what happens to capital accumulation, occupational choices, and in particular human capital accumulation. So these three channels have not been explored yet in the literature when looking at this type of policy. Now, what we see from the existing studies is that average productivity can decline even because of the worsening composition, or it's unclear what happens to average productivity. Nevertheless, total output increases because of this massive increase in the number of firms. But of course, as open questions and interesting open questions, it remains what are the possible interactions between frictions that firms face in the formal sector and these formalization policies, in particular, reduction in entry costs. Given this negative composition effect, this is quite key to analyze. So, as final remarks, let me just then emphasize that the literature has made substantial progress in understanding the main determinants of firms' choices regarding informality. Okay. But still, many important unanswered questions regarding firms remain open. And in particular, we have only started to analyze the dynamics of firms' decisions and how these dynamic decisions regarding the margins of informality, how do they relate to other frictions? And in particular, in my opinion, a big open question that remains to be answered is whether informality represents a stepping stone for potentially high-growing firms that are facing some other form of constraint. Is a step, and therefore informality could work as a stepping stone for them to build up their productivity and grow out of these constraints, or whether informality is just misallocating resources in the economy and therefore leading to a worse equilibrium in terms of resource allocation. On the worker side, we have many more open questions. Workers, interestingly, workers have received less attention than firms in the informality literature. Here I've listed three interesting questions that I think are worth pursuing, but let me stop here and I look forward to your questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly insightful and helpful. So now what I'm going to do is go through some of the questions that we've had. We are coming up to the hour, but hopefully we can hang around for maybe 5 or 10 minutes more and get around to some of these questions. And if I don't get around to your question, apologies in advance, but after the webinar, I'm sure Gabriel might not mind if you email him if you want to chase anything up. So the top question that we have is from Edouard, who asks whether there's a literature on migration effects of informality. And then also Ramya asks about how much we can trust the ILO estimates of informality, and also whether informality is something that's been changing a lot over time.
No, there's and apologies for running a bit over time. There's a lot of ground to cover. These are three great questions. So in terms of the first, yes, there is a literature that has emphasized or associated migration to informality for migrants when they arrive to their destinations. And there's many different papers that document that. Another interesting and right now very active area is actually how informality shape these the effects from migration, both at mostly at destination places. So this is very active and still a very interesting area of research. In terms of the how reliable are the ILO estimates, so of course they face limitations in terms of how they can measure informal employment, and that's mainly data availability across countries. That said, I think they do provide a very good comparable measure across developing countries that have surveys that directly ask about informal jobs. One important limitation I would highlight is that if you remember, there's no data essentially on the Northern Hemisphere, but that doesn't mean that there's no informal employment here. Rather than it's just mostly coming from, for example, undocumented workers and undocumented migrants that work and are completely at the margin of the data collection institution. So that zero, I don't find it reliable, but I think they provide a very good measure for the global South, let's say. Now, in terms of the changing nature of informality, most definitely. So probably when back in the 70s, 80s, perhaps the dual view of informality was a good reflection of most developing economies in terms of describing what the informal sector is, not necessarily in urban centers, but most likely in rural settings. And it can still be the case that it's a good description in some more agricultural developing economies, for example, sub-Saharan Africa. Now, it's not, I don't think it's a good description for any urban informal employment that one analyzes and urban informal economy that one analyzes, but still, of course, is likely to remain as a changing object because it's not, it's a result of firms and workers making their decisions.
Thank you. So I'll ask a couple more questions that I've been receiving lots of upvotes. So Martin asks about workers that are how they value being formally employed when working for a formal firm. So on the intensive margin, is that driven by a lack of bargaining power for the people who are in a formal firm but are informally employed, or is it because they don't really care about being formally employed even if they're at a formal firm?
No, that's also a great question, and one that the literature has not provided the answer to. So we still don't know the determinants of the in particular the intensive margin. We still don't know like in detail what drives firms and workers' decision. Most likely, but I think your question also touches upon a fundamental question that we now start seeing some progress in the literature, which is what is the value of a formal versus informal job for workers and how that changes over their life cycle. So that's a key area. And in particular, one of the things that the formal job does is that it might provide more job security and greater insurance to workers conditional on being employed because, for example, they have unemployment insurance. On the other hand, the presence of informal jobs can be a form of insurance on aggregate because if workers know if they lose their job in the formal sector, they can access an informal job more quickly than otherwise if this job was not present. So like kind of trade-offs and how they play out in the life cycle is key not only for workers in general, but also in particular for women, because in places where the labor regulation is quite strict and rigid, informal jobs provide more flexibility that could actually help reducing, for example, the career costs of having children for women.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from JS who asks about the role of platform business and non-standard forms of work and how that interacts with informality and formality. And then we also have a question from Andy who asks about whether the within firm comparison that you mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation that shows that within firms there doesn't seem to be a difference between informal and formal workers' compensation. Does that look at total compensation over their whole lifetime and take into account things like pensions and social security, or is that just kind of a static measure that just looks at their wage at a given time?
No, I'm loving the question. So like, let me start by the second that it's a measurement question. So the short answer is that no, it doesn't take into account all the potential, especially benefits that could accrue over time. It also doesn't take into account the full extent of even the tax. It's not even a precise measure, a precise static measure, because it doesn't take into account the net tax payments that could inside in the formal wage, and also other forms of non-wage benefits. So like it's a very imperfect measure, but it's just kind of like to spark the discussion. Now, the first question is key because it's an agenda in itself. I would say though that actually the presence of gig, so the emergence of gig employment, gig jobs, and of flexible work, extremely flexible work contracts in developed countries, such as the zero-hour contracts or the mini jobs, they do approximate labor markets from richer countries, developed countries, to the labor market in developing countries, exactly because the intensive margin of informality is very similar in many dimensions to, say, this hyper-flexible labor contracts available to firms. A key difference is that in developed countries, this is a legal, of course, form of employment that is accessible to all firms, but in particular to high productivity firms. So they are the ones who can outsource or hire many workers in this hyper-flexible, using this hyper-flexible contracts. Whereas informality, because it's not legal, it can only be used or relied upon the least productive, smaller firms in the economy. So that has potentially very different aggregate implications in terms of allocation of resources. Now, in terms of the relationship between firms and workers, there are many points of similarity. And of course, it's still very much unclear how the decision to work in platforms compares to the decision of being a self-employed outside platforms and being a wage worker, be it informal or formal. So one of the limitations that we have here is data, because most household surveys that we use to analyze informal employment in developing countries do not directly ask yet whether this is, say, self-employment working for a platform or what kind, like the gig economy hasn't been incorporated in this service directly. So we need to use other forms of data to analyze this, but it's an extremely important area for future research.
So that's on mute. So I think we'll end with two final questions, if that's okay with you. So the first is from Werner, who asks whether you think that automation could play a role in increasing or affecting the level of informal employment in developing countries in the future. And then we also had a question from Karen, who was asking about thinking about the literature on the workers' side of informality with a gender lens in mind, and whether there's been any work to understand whether certain effects affect females more or less than males. So yeah, those final two questions.
So the automation question, this is a question that or the answer will change every year almost, depending on what we mean by automation. So automation that is concentrated in manufacturing was not likely to affect informality much. One, because already informality levels within manufacturing are much lower than within services and retail in developing countries. And therefore, and so if automation is concentrated in manufacturing and affecting a small fraction of jobs there, the overall effect on informality is likely to be limited. Now, of course, as we move to, say, AI affecting the service industry and the type of jobs that can be substituted, this could have then important equilibrium effects on workers and transitions between formal and informal jobs. Beyond that, I cannot say much, besides the fact that there is virtually no paper looking at that. Now, in terms of the gender question, this is an absolutely key area and one that I would argue should be at the core of any informality discussion, because, for example, so women are overrepresented in informal jobs. This could be due to a variety of reasons. But one thing that has been emerging more and more in developing cities in particular, where commuting costs are very high because of poor transport infrastructure, is that there is association between the choice of being formal and as a way of reducing commuting times for women. So it's yet another margin through which informal jobs could provide extra flexibility for women. It's not only that they can work fewer hours or more flexible hours, but also informal jobs tend to be less concentrated spatially than formal jobs, therefore being closer to where women live, allowing for lower commuting times for them, which again, because starting from an equilibrium where women are overburdened and completely unfair, let's say, allocation of domestic production to them and childbearing and child raising responsibilities. This could be a massive factor determining the decision of women to be informally employed. On the other hand, we do have now growing from evidence that will probably make it into the second version of this literature review, that the presence of informality helps reducing the overall employment, the employment cost of having children on women. So the evidence comes from Chile, but also from Brazil now. And in these two countries, the labor regulation is extremely rigid and basically prevents part-time jobs. So like if you want to be formally employed, you have to be a full-time worker. So that, of course, makes it much harder for women, especially after they have their first child, to be in the formal sector. So what this growing evidence shows is that the overall cost of having children in terms of employment, wages, etc., can be lower if there is access to informal jobs. But there is this transition between formal to informal jobs after the child is born. So what's unclear and yet open area for discussion is the net welfare effects of these. Of having, say, these informal jobs available to women vis-a-vis an equilibrium where women cannot access that, but then eventually they can return to the formal sector more quickly.
Great, thank you so much for staying to answer those questions. It was incredibly insightful again, as was your presentation. I think we're going to end things there today. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you again, Gabriel. I'm just putting in the chat now a link to the VoxDev website where this VoxDevLit is hosted, and we will also be uploading a recording of the presentation from this session to our website and also to YouTube afterwards. Thank you very much to everyone again, and we'll see you soon. Stay posted for information about our future VoxDevLits. Over the next couple of months, we're going to be releasing updates to our existing ones as well as some new ones further down the line. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.